In the grand corridors of Valdoria Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble halls, a king's heart battles against the weight of his crown. What happens when the man who has everything must choose between personal happiness and the survival of his kingdom? When whispered secrets threaten to tear apart not just a marriage, but an entire monarchy. This is the story of King Alexander III, whose most difficult decision would send shockwaves through the palace walls and leave his beloved Queen Isabella shattered in ways that would change the royal family forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ornate breakfast room of Valdoria Palace as King Alexander III sat in unusual silence, his coffee growing cold while he stared at the documents spread before him. The weight of 43 years showed in the lines around his eyes, deepened by the sleepless nights that had become his constant companion over the past month. Queen Isabella entered with her usual grace, her silk morning gown rustling softly as she moved. At 38, she retained the ethereal beauty that had captivated the nation when Alexander had chosen her as his bride 15 years ago. Her chestnut hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and her green eyes sparkled with the warmth that had made her beloved by both her husband and their subjects. "You're up early again," Isabella observed, settling into her chair across from him. She reached for the silver teapot, her movements elegant and practiced from years of royal protocol. "The council meeting isn't until 10. Alexander looked up from his papers, and Isabella immediately noticed something different in his expression. The usual tenderness in his dark blue eyes had been replaced by something she couldn't quite identify, a mixture of pain and resolve that made her stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread. "Isabella, we need to talk," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her pause mid-pour. The delicate china teacup clinked against its saucer as she set it down, her hands suddenly unsteady. In 15 years of marriage, Alexander had never used that particular tone with her, formal, distant, almost like he was addressing a foreign diplomat rather than his wife. "What's wrong?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. The past few weeks had been strange, with Alexander spending long hours in closed meetings with his advisors, returning to their chambers late at night, and leaving early in the morning. When she had asked about it, he had assured her it was merely state business, nothing for her to worry about. Alexander stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The roses Isabella had personally overseen were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the heaviness settling over the room. He clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture she recognized from state ceremonies when he was struggling with difficult decisions. "The kingdom is facing the most serious crisis since my father's reign," he began, his voice measured and controlled. "The economic situation is far worse than we've allowed the public to know. The neighboring kingdom of Astoria is threatening our eastern borders, and our allies are questioning our ability to maintain stability." Isabella rose from her chair, moving closer to him. "Alexander, you're frightening me. What does this have to do with us? We've faced challenges before." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the look of a man who had already made an impossible decision and was now forced to live with its consequences. "The Royal Council has presented me with an ultimatum," he continued, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "They believe the only way to secure the kingdom's future is through a strategic alliance that would require—" He paused, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that betrayed his carefully maintained composure. "Require what?" Isabella whispered, though she was beginning to understand the direction this conversation was heading. "A marriage alliance with Princess Sophia of Astoria," Alexander said finally, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "The council believes it's the only way to prevent a war that could destroy both our kingdoms." The color drained from Isabella's face as the full implications hit her. "A marriage alliance," she repeated slowly. "But you're already married. To me." Alexander's jaw tightened, and she could see the muscle working as he struggled with emotions he was trying desperately to control. "The council is demanding an annulment of our marriage. They argue that since we have no heir after 15 years, the marriage has failed in its primary purpose. They claim it's grounds for dissolution under ancient royal law." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. No heir, failed marriage, dissolution, terms that reduced 15 years of love, partnership, and devotion to mere legal technicalities. She gripped the back of a chair for support, her knees suddenly weak. "And what did you tell them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alexander's composure finally cracked. He crossed the room to her in 3 quick strides, taking her hands in his. His were trembling slightly, she realized with shock. Alexander never trembled. I told them I needed time to consider all options, he said urgently. Isabella, you have to understand, I never wanted this. I've spent weeks looking for alternatives, consulting with legal experts, trying to find any other way. But the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Intelligence reports suggest Astoria is planning to invade within the month if we don't agree to their terms. Isabella pulled her hands free and walked to the window, her mind reeling. Below, the palace staff was beginning their daily routines, unaware that their queen's world was crumbling in the breakfast room above them. The gardener was tending to her roses, the same roses she had planted shortly after their wedding, dreaming of the children who would someday play among them. How long have you known? She asked without turning around. 3 weeks, Alexander admitted. I wanted to find a solution before involving you. I thought perhaps if I could negotiate different terms, or if our ambassadors could broker a different kind of alliance. 3 weeks. Isabella's voice was flat, emotionless. You've been carrying this alone for 3 weeks. I was trying to protect you. She whirled around, and Alexander was startled by the fierce pain in her eyes. Protect me? By lying to me? By letting me continue planning our anniversary celebration while you were contemplating ending our marriage? Isabella, please, no. Her voice was stronger now, though he could see her hands shaking. Don't you dare ask me to understand. Don't ask me to be reasonable about this. You're asking me to step aside so you can marry another woman to save the kingdom. You're asking me to accept that our love, our marriage, our life together means less than political expediency. Alexander's own pain was evident now, the royal mask he wore in public completely abandoned. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think there's a moment when I'm not thinking about what this would cost us both? You are the love of my life, Isabella. You always have been. But I'm also a king, and sometimes being a king means making choices that destroy the man. The anguish in his voice broke through Isabella's anger, but it didn't lessen her pain. She understood duty. She had been trained for it her entire life, had embraced it when she married Alexander, had accepted the sacrifices that came with the crown. But this felt different. This felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. What about love? She asked quietly. What about the vows we made? The promises we've kept for 15 years? Those vows included protecting this kingdom and its people, Alexander replied, though the words clearly pained him. If we go to war with Astoria, thousands will die. Our economy will collapse. The suffering will be immeasurable. And if you marry Princess Sophia, what then? Do you expect me to simply disappear? To retire quietly to some distant estate while you build a new life with a new queen? Alexander hadn't considered the practical implications of what would happen to Isabella after an annulment. The realization struck him like a physical blow. In all his agonizing over the decision itself, he had somehow failed to think through what it would mean for her future, her position, her very identity. I assumed you would retain your title, your properties. You would always be cared for, always respected as former queen. Former queen. Isabella laughed bitterly. Do you hear yourself? You're offering me a pension and a title that would mark me as a failure for the rest of my life. Every woman in the kingdom would know that I was set aside because I couldn't provide you with an heir. Every history book would record me as the queen who wasn't enough. The cruelty of it hit Alexander fully for the first time. In trying to save his kingdom, he would be destroying the woman he loved more than life itself. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. There has to be another way, he said desperately. I won't accept that this is our only option. Isabella studied his face, seeing the man she had fallen in love with beneath the crown he wore. She could see his pain, his desperation, his genuine love for her. But she could also see something else, the resolution of a king who would ultimately do what he believed was right for his people, regardless of personal cost. How long do we have? She asked quietly. The council is expecting my decision within the week. The Astrian delegation arrives in 10 days. 10 days. 10 days to process the end of her marriage, her role, her entire identity. 10 days to figure out how to survive the complete destruction of her world. I need time alone, Isabella said finally. I can't discuss this rationally right now. Alexander nodded, though every instinct told him to reach for her, to hold her, to somehow comfort the pain he was causing. Isabella, I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever decision I'm forced to make, you will always be the only woman I have ever truly loved. She met his eyes for a long moment, and he saw in them a lifetime of shared memories, shared dreams, shared love. But he also saw the beginning of something else, a protective wall being built, brick by brick, to shield her heart from further damage. Love, she said softly, should be more than just words when the real test comes. With that, she left the room, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor as she walked away. Alexander remained by the window, watching her roses sway in the morning breeze, understanding that the hardest part of this impossible situation was yet to come. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the palace chapel, casting colored shadows across the stone floor where Queen Isabella knelt in solitary prayer. She had fled here after their devastating conversation, seeking solace in the one place where she had always found peace. The chapel held so many memories, their wedding ceremony, countless Christmas services, quiet moments of reflection during difficult times. Now it felt like a sanctuary where she could finally allow herself to fall apart. Her prayers had long since dissolved into wordless grief. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of devotion, reduced to a political calculation. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears that had been flowing intermittently since morning. The silk of her gown was wrinkled now, her carefully arranged hair disheveled from running her fingers through it in distress. The soft click of the chapel door made her stiffen. She had given strict instructions not to be disturbed, but when she turned, she saw Lady Margaret, her closest friend and lady-in-waiting, approaching cautiously. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, "I'm sorry to intrude, but there are urgent matters requiring your attention." Isabella wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, trying to compose herself. Margaret had been with her since before her marriage, had witnessed every joy and sorrow of her reign. If anyone could be trusted with this devastation, it was her. "What matters?" Isabella asked, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Margaret hesitated, clearly noting the Queen's distress. "The preparations for the anniversary celebration. The guest list needs final approval, the menu requires confirmation, and the musicians need to know which pieces you'd prefer for the ceremonial dance." The anniversary celebration. Isabella had completely forgotten. In 3 weeks, they were supposed to be celebrating 15 years of marriage with a grand ball attended by nobility from across Europe. She had been planning it for months, choosing every detail to create a perfect evening that would showcase their enduring love story. "Cancel it," Isabella said quietly. "Your Majesty? Cancel the celebration. All of it." Isabella's voice was stronger now, though still strained. "Send regrets to all the guests. Tell them there has been a change in circumstances." Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. "Cancel the anniversary celebration? But, Your Majesty, the invitations have been sent, arrangements have been made. The diplomatic implications alone, Margaret." Isabella stood and faced her friend, and Margaret was shocked by the pain evident in the Queen's usually serene expression. "There will be no anniversary to celebrate." The lady-in-waiting stared at her in confusion and growing concern. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. Has something happened?" "Are you and His Majesty?" "I can't discuss it right now," Isabella interrupted. "Please, just do as I ask. And Margaret, I may need to rely on your friendship more than your service in the coming days." Before Margaret could respond, Isabella swept past her and out of the chapel, leaving her oldest friend staring after her in bewilderment. Meanwhile, in the king's private study, Alexander was discovering that sharing his burden had not lightened it. Lord Chancellor Harrison, a stern man in his 60s who had served Alexander's father before him, sat across from the king's desk with a stack of legal documents. "The annulment proceedings can be initiated immediately," Harrison was saying in his dry, professional tone. "Given the absence of heirs and the urgent political circumstances, I believe we can expedite the process through the Royal Court of Appeals. The precedent was set during your great-grandfather's reign." Alexander stared at the documents without really seeing them. "What precedent?" "King Edmund IV dissolved his marriage to Queen Catherine when she failed to produce an heir within 12 years. He subsequently married Princess Adelaide of Lorraine, securing a crucial military alliance. Their union produced 3 sons and ushered in 25 years of peace and prosperity." "And what happened to Queen Catherine?" Harrison consulted his notes. "She retired to the Northern Abbey, where she lived quietly until her death some years later. By all accounts, she adapted well to her new circumstances." Adapted well. The phrase struck Alexander as particularly cruel. How did one adapt well to having one's entire life torn away? He thought of Isabella's face that morning, the way her hands had trembled when she understood what he was telling her. The Queen Isabella's situation would be handled differently, of course, Harrison continued, oblivious to Alexander's growing discomfort. She would retain her royal rank and a generous settlement, perhaps a residence in the countryside, away from the capital to avoid any awkwardness with the new queen. Her name is Isabella, Alexander said sharply. Not the Queen Isabella situation. She is my wife, and she will be treated with the respect and dignity she deserves. Harrison blinked in surprise at the king's tone. Of course, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect. I was simply addressing the practical considerations. Alexander stood and walked to his window, much as he had done that morning. The view from his study overlooked the courtyard where Isabella often walked with their dogs, two golden spaniels they had rescued as puppies shortly after their wedding. As if summoned by his thoughts, he saw her now, moving slowly across the cobblestones, the dogs trotting beside her. Even from this distance, he could see the dejection in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged, as if she were carrying an impossible weight. What about alternatives? Alexander asked without turning around. Military options, economic sanctions, other forms of negotiation? Sire, we've explored every possibility. Astoria's terms are clear: a marriage alliance or war. Their princess is of appropriate age and has been educated for precisely this role. The match would be strategically perfect and personally devastating, Alexander muttered. Sire. Nothing. Alexander returned to his desk, his jaw set in grim determination. I want you to compile a complete report on our military capabilities. Our actual capabilities, not the optimistic assessments the generals prefer to give me. I want to know exactly what we would be facing if we chose to fight. Harrison frowned. Your Majesty, surely you're not considering. I am considering every option, Alexander said firmly. I will not condemn my wife to a life of exile and disgrace without first ensuring there is absolutely no alternative. But the risks are mine to evaluate. Alexander's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a king ending a discussion. Prepare the report. I want it by tomorrow morning. As Harrison gathered his documents and left, Alexander remained at his desk, staring at a portrait of Isabella that sat in a silver frame near his inkwell. It had been painted shortly after their wedding, capturing her radiant smile and the joy that had seemed to illuminate her from within. He wondered if he would ever see that joy again. That evening, dinner was a strained affair. Alexander and Isabella sat at opposite ends of their private dining table, the silence between them filled with the weight of unspoken words. Neither had much appetite, though they went through the motions of eating for the sake of their staff. I spoke with Lord Chancellor Harrison today, Alexander said finally, setting down his fork. The annulment process would take approximately 6 weeks to complete. Isabella's hand tightened around her wine glass. 6 weeks to legally erase 15 years of marriage. How efficient. Isabella, please don't what? Don't make this difficult for you. Don't feel betrayed that the man who swore to love and honor me is now consulting lawyers about the fastest way to be rid of me. Alexander winced at her words, but he couldn't deny their truth. I'm trying to find another way. I've ordered a complete military assessment. Perhaps if we can demonstrate that war is not inevitable, and if you can't. Isabella's voice was steady, but he could see the pain she was trying to hide. What then, Alexander? Do you honestly believe you can go through with this? Alexander met her gaze, and, for a moment, she saw the uncertainty he had been hiding. The confident king's mask slipped, revealing the frightened man beneath. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I don't know if I'm strong enough to choose duty over love. I don't know if I can live with myself if I send thousands of soldiers to die because I couldn't make the necessary sacrifice. And I don't know if I can live with myself if I destroy you to save them. Isabella felt her anger soften slightly at his honesty. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not the king with his royal duties and impossible decisions, but Alexander, who struggled with the weight of choices that had no good answers. What does your heart tell you? She asked softly. My heart tells me to refuse the council's demand, to send the Astorian delegation away, and to face whatever consequences come. Alexander's voice was rough with emotion. My heart tells me that a kingdom built on the destruction of love is no kingdom worth preserving. And your mind? Alexander was quiet for a long moment. My mind reminds me that I am responsible for 3 million people who look to me for protection. It reminds me that my personal happiness cannot come at the cost of their safety and prosperity. Isabella nodded slowly. She had always known this about him, had admired his deep sense of responsibility even when it meant personal sacrifice. It was one of the qualities that had made her fall in love with him. Now that same quality threatened to tear them apart. I've been thinking about what you said this morning, she said carefully. about ancient royal law providing grounds for annulment. Alexander looked up sharply, hope flickering in his eyes. Have you found something? The opposite, actually. Isabella's voice was sad but determined. I consulted with Professor Whitmore at the Royal Academy. The law you referenced was specifically created to allow kings to set aside wives who could not produce heirs. It was designed to prioritize the succession above personal feelings. Isabella, let me finish. She held up her hand, and he could see her gathering her composure for what she needed to say. The law exists because our predecessors understood that sometimes the crown demands sacrifices that ordinary people would never be asked to make. Your great-grandfather used it not because he stopped loving Queen Catherine, but because he loved his kingdom more. The parallel was clear and painful. Alexander shook his head. I am not my great-grandfather. I will not simply accept that this is the only way. But what if it is? Isabella's question hung in the air between them. What if, after all your investigations and assessments, you determine that marriage to Princess Sophia truly is the only way to prevent a war? What then? Alexander had no answer, because deep down, he feared that was exactly what he would discover. The silence stretched between them until Isabella spoke again. I want you to know that whatever you decide, I understand the impossible position you're in. I may hate the choice, but I don't hate you for having to make it. Her grace in the face of such personal devastation only made Alexander's guilt more overwhelming. How could he destroy someone so inherently noble? How could he choose duty over the woman who embodied every quality he admired? I love you, he said desperately. Whatever happens, whatever choice I'm forced to make, I need you to know that you are the great love of my life. No crown, no duty, no political alliance will ever change that. Isabella smiled sadly. I know, and that's what makes this so much worse. If you didn't love me, if this were just a matter of political convenience, I could hate you for it. But you do love me, and you're still considering destroying our marriage for the good of the kingdom. What does that say about the power of love when it comes into conflict with the demands of the crown? The question haunted Alexander long after Isabella had excused herself and retired to their chambers. He remained in the dining room, staring at the cold remains of their meal, wondering if there was any decision he could make that wouldn't leave him forever changed by its consequences. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. 3 days had passed since Alexander's devastating revelation, and the palace had taken on an atmosphere of unnatural quiet. Staff members moved through the corridors with careful efficiency, sensing the tension that radiated from the royal quarters, but not understanding its source. Even the dogs seemed subdued, following Isabella on her increasingly long walks through the gardens with less than their usual enthusiasm. Isabella had requested separate chambers for the time being, claiming she needed space to process the situation. Alexander had reluctantly agreed, though the empty space beside him in their bed felt like a physical wound. Each morning, he woke hoping the previous days had been an elaborate nightmare, only to be confronted again with the impossible choice that awaited him. The military assessment had arrived that morning, and its contents were even worse than Alexander had feared. General Morrison, his most trusted military advisor, sat across from him in the war room, maps spread across the table between them. Our intelligence indicates that Astoria has been preparing for this conflict for at least 2 years, Morrison was saying, his weathered face grave. They've modernized their artillery, formed alliances with 2 neighboring kingdoms, and their army now outnumbers ours 3-1. Alexander studied the troop movements marked in red across the map. What about our defensive capabilities? Strong, but not sufficient for an extended conflict. We could hold the capital for perhaps 6 months, maybe 8 if rationing is implemented immediately. But, sire, the cost in civilian lives would be catastrophic. They're targeting our supply lines, our trade routes. Even if we ultimately prevailed, the kingdom would be economically devastated for a generation. And the likelihood of victory? General Morrison hesitated. In a purely military sense, perhaps 30%. If we could secure additional allies, that might improve to 45%. But, sire, those odds come with the assumption of acceptable losses, which in this case would mean the deaths of an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 soldiers and civilians. The numbers hit Alexander like physical blows. 60,000 people, fathers, sons, brothers, who would die because he chose love over duty. He thought of Isabella's face, her pain, her grace under impossible circumstances, and then he thought of 60,000 families receiving news that their loved ones would never come home. What about the marriage alliance? How certain is it that Princess Sophia's marriage to me would prevent this war? According to our ambassadors, extremely certain. King Ferdinand of Astoria has made it clear that this marriage represents his preferred solution. Princess Sophia would bring a substantial dowry, access to their trade networks, and the promise of mutual defense. It would transform potential enemies into powerful allies. Alexander nodded slowly, though the gesture felt like signing a death warrant, either for his marriage or for his people. Thank you, General. Please prepare contingency plans for both scenarios, military resistance, and the alternative. After Morrison left, Alexander sat alone with the maps and casualty projections, feeling the full weight of the crown that he had once worn so proudly. He understood now why his father had often looked so tired during the final years of his reign. Some decisions aged a man decades in moments. Meanwhile, Isabella was discovering her own form of torment. She had retreated to the palace library, surrounded by histories of royal marriages, annulments, and political alliances. If she was going to lose her life as queen, she wanted to understand exactly how it would happen and what her predecessors had endured. The books painted a grim picture. Queens who had been set aside for political reasons rarely fared well. Some disappeared into convents, others lived in exile. Many died young from what the histories diplomatically called melancholy. Even those who had adapted to their circumstances had lived the rest of their lives defined by their failure to fulfill their primary role as royal wives. Lady Margaret found her there as evening shadows grew long across the library floor. Isabella was sitting at the great oak table, surrounded by open volumes, her eyes red from reading and crying. "Your Majesty," Margaret said gently, "you missed dinner. Cook has prepared a tray." Isabella looked up from a particularly depressing account of Queen Catherine's final years. "Margaret, do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you hadn't entered royal service?" The question surprised Margaret, who had served the royal family for over 20 years. I suppose I might have married, had children of my own. But, Your Majesty, I've never regretted my choices. Serving you has been an honor." "But, you had choices," Isabella said quietly. "You could have left at any time, could have built a different life. Queens don't have that luxury. We marry for duty, live for duty, and when we fail in that duty..." She gestured to the books around her. Margaret moved closer, noticing the titles Isabella had been reading. "Your Majesty, what is this about? These histories of annulments and failed marriages. Why are you studying such things?" Isabella looked at her oldest friend, debating how much to reveal. The secret was eating away at her, but she had promised Alexander she would let him announce any decision in his own time and manner. "I'm trying to understand the true cost of being a queen," Isabella said finally. "The histories make it all sound so noble: duty, sacrifice, service to the kingdom. But they rarely mention what it costs the women who wear the crown." "You're frightening me," Margaret said honestly. "This doesn't sound like the confident, happy queen I've served for 15 years. Has something happened between you and His Majesty?" Isabella's composure finally cracked. The tears she had been holding back for 3 days began to flow freely, and Margaret quickly moved to her side, offering comfort without understanding its cause. "Everything is falling apart," Isabella whispered. "Everything I thought was permanent, everything I built my life around, it's all crumbling." Margaret held her as she wept, murmuring gentle reassurances while her own mind raced with worry. She had seen Isabella face difficulties before, the early struggles to conceive, political pressures, diplomatic crises, but never had she seen her so fundamentally broken. "Whatever it is," Margaret said firmly, "we'll find a way through it. You are stronger than you know, and you're not facing it alone." Isabella wanted to believe her, but the books around her told a different story. They told of queens who had thought themselves strong, who had believed their love was enough to overcome political necessity, only to discover that in the world of royalty, love was always secondary to power. That night, Alexander found himself walking the palace corridors like a ghost. Sleep had become impossible, and the walls of his chambers felt like they were closing in on him. He found himself outside Isabella's new rooms, his hand raised to knock, but stopped himself. What could he say to her that he hadn't already said? What comfort could he offer when he was the source of her pain? Instead, he continued walking until he reached the portrait gallery, where paintings of his ancestors gazed down at him with stern faces and knowing eyes. He stopped before the portrait of King Edmund IV, his great-grandfather who had made the choice Alexander now faced. Edmund looked confident in the painting, noble and decisive. The plaque beneath his portrait praised his wisdom in securing a crucial alliance through his marriage to Princess Adelaide. There was no mention of Queen Catherine, no acknowledgement of the personal cost of his political triumph. Was it worth it? Alexander asked the painted figure. Did you ever regret your choice? Did you love Princess Adelaide, or did you simply learn to live with duty? The painted eyes offered no answer, but Alexander imagined he could see something in them, a sadness that the artist had perhaps captured without meaning to, a recognition of loss beneath the royal authority. He moved on to other portraits, studying the faces of kings and queens who had made difficult choices throughout the centuries. Some had chosen love over duty and plunged their kingdoms into chaos. Others had chosen duty over love and lived long, successful reigns marked by political stability and personal emptiness. As dawn approached, Alexander found himself back in his chambers, staring at the empty bed where Isabella should have been sleeping beside him. The sight of her pillow, still bearing the faint scent of her perfume, nearly broke his resolve entirely. How could he continue living in this bed, in these rooms, knowing that his choice had driven her away? A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting to see his valet with the morning reports. Instead, Isabella entered, still wearing her nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that reminded him powerfully of their early years of marriage. She looked exhausted, but determined. "I've been thinking all night," she said without preamble. "About what you told me, about the choice you're facing, about what it would mean for both of us." Alexander's heart raced with hope and terror. Had she found a solution? Had she decided she couldn't bear the thought of separation? Or had she come to tell him she understood why he had to choose duty over love? "I've been thinking too," he said quietly. "About the military reports, about the consequences of war, about the responsibility I bear for every life in this kingdom." Isabella nodded, moving to sit on the edge of the bed they had shared for so many years. "I know you have. I can see it in your face, in the way you've aged years in just these few days. The weight of this decision is destroying you." "Isabella, let me speak, please." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I've spent 3 days being angry, being hurt, feeling betrayed, and abandoned. Those feelings are real, and they're justified. But I've also been thinking about who you are, about the man I fell in love with, and why I love him." Alexander held his breath, afraid to hope, afraid to despair. "You are a good king, Alexander. You are a man who puts the welfare of others before your own comfort. It's one of the reasons I've admired you for 15 years, even when that quality has cost us both dearly." Isabella's voice began to waver slightly. "If you were the kind of man who could easily choose personal happiness over the lives of his subjects, you wouldn't be the man I married." "What are you saying?" Alexander asked, though he feared he understood. Isabella met his eyes, and he saw in them a terrible, heartbreaking resolve. "I'm saying that I've read about Queen Catherine, about how she spent the last 20 years of her life. I'm saying that I understand the choice you're facing and the choice I'm facing. And I'm saying that if you decide this marriage alliance is truly necessary to prevent a war, I will not fight you." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had expected anger, tears, pleas for reconsideration. He had not expected this quiet, devastating nobility. "Isabella, no? I can't ask that of you." "You're not asking," she said simply. "I'm offering. Because I love you, and I love this kingdom, and I understand that sometimes love means letting go." Alexander crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. They were cold and trembling slightly, betraying the cost of her apparent composure. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "I can't accept that this is our only choice." Isabella smiled sadly, reaching up to touch his face. "My darling man, you're going to exhaust yourself looking for alternatives that may not exist. And while you're searching, you're torturing both of us with false hope. So what do you suggest?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded her answer. "Make your decision based on what's best for the kingdom," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Don't factor in what it will cost me. Don't let your love for me influence a choice that affects millions of people. Be the king your subjects need, not the husband your heart wants to be." Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she finally allowed herself to cry fully. She felt so small, so fragile in his embrace, this woman who was showing more courage than any soldier on a battlefield. "I can't do this without you," he whispered into her hair. "You won't be without me," Isabella said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Even if we can't be married, even if I have to watch you build a life with someone else, you'll always have my love. That's the one thing no law can annul, no political alliance can change. They held each other as the sun rose outside their window, both knowing that this might be one of their last moments of peace before the full weight of royal duty crushed the personal happiness they had built together. In the growing light, Alexander could see their reflection in the mirror across the room, a king and queen embracing for what might be the last time as husband and wife. The storm that had been gathering for days was about to break, and neither of them was sure they would survive it intact. The Asturian delegation had arrived with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a momentous diplomatic occasion. Princess Sophia, accompanied by her father's most trusted advisors, had been received with full royal honors. A banquet, formal presentations, and careful adherence to every protocol designed to demonstrate respect and welcome. Alexander had performed his role flawlessly, the very picture of a gracious host, while Isabella had remained conspicuously absent, citing a sudden illness. Now, on the third day of the delegation's visit, Alexander found himself in his private study with Princess Sophia herself, ostensibly discussing the terms of their potential alliance. She was, he had to admit, everything the political advisors had promised: beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, and possessed of the diplomatic skills necessary for such a crucial union. Under different circumstances, he might have been impressed by her obvious qualities. Princess Sophia was 26 years old, with the blonde hair and blue eyes that were the signature of Asturian nobility. She carried herself with confidence, but not arrogance, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had demonstrated a genuine interest in the welfare of both kingdoms. She was, by any objective measure, an ideal candidate for queen. "Your Majesty," she was saying, her voice cultured and pleasant, "I want you to know that I understand the delicate nature of this situation. I have no illusions about the personal sacrifice this alliance would require from both of us." Alexander looked up from the documents spread before them: trade agreements, military pacts, ceremonial protocols. "Your Highness, I appreciate your directness. This is indeed a complicated situation." Sophia smiled, and Alexander noticed that her expression held genuine warmth rather than calculated charm. "My father has taught me that successful political alliances require honesty about expectations. I would not expect you to love me, at least not initially. But I would hope that we could build a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dedication to our people's welfare." Her maturity and practical approach should have made Alexander feel better about the potential arrangement. Instead, it only highlighted the unfairness of the situation for everyone involved. Sophia deserved a husband who could love her without reservation, just as Isabella deserved to remain married to the man she had devoted 15 years of her life to loving. "And your own feelings about this arrangement?" Alexander asked carefully. "I have been trained since childhood to marry for political advantage," Sophia replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "I understand my duty, and I am prepared to fulfill it. That said, I would prefer to marry a man I could eventually come to love, rather than one who would see me only as a political necessity." The honesty in her voice made Alexander's guilt even more acute. Sophia was not a scheming princess seeking power. She was a young woman trying to make the best of circumstances beyond her control, just as he and Isabella were. "Your Highness, I must ask, if this marriage alliance were not necessary to prevent war, would you choose differently?" Sophia considered the question carefully. "If I had complete freedom of choice? Perhaps. There is a young duke in my father's court who has shown interest, and I confess I find his company pleasant. But such choices are luxuries that people in our positions cannot afford." Alexander nodded, understanding her position all too well. "And if this alliance moves forward, what would you expect from me as a husband?" "Respect, courtesy, and fidelity once we are married," Sophia answered promptly. "I would expect you to honor me publicly as your queen and to work with me as a partner in governing. I would not expect you to forget your past or to pretend that our marriage began from love." Her reasonable expectations only made Alexander feel worse. Sophia was offering him a rational, adult partnership that could indeed benefit both kingdoms. She was not asking for the impossible, was not demanding romantic love that he couldn't give. She was simply asking for the basic respect due to a wife and queen. "Your Highness, you should know that Queen Isabella and our marriage has been built on genuine affection. Ending it would be personally devastating for both of us." "I understand," Sophia said softly. "I have heard that yours is one of the rare royal marriages based on love. I cannot imagine how difficult this decision must be." Her compassion was unexpected and somehow made everything worse. Alexander had hoped to find Sophia disagreeable, political, calculating, anything that would make the choice easier. Instead, he was faced with a genuinely admirable young woman who deserved better than to be married to a man pining for another wife. If we were to proceed with this alliance, Alexander said carefully, I would want to ensure that you understood there would be no animosity toward Queen Isabella. She would be treated with honor and respect, both publicly and privately. Of course, Sophia agreed immediately. I would never expect otherwise. Queen Isabella has served your kingdom with distinction for 15 years. She has earned the right to dignity regardless of how this situation resolves. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock interrupted them. At Alexander's permission, Lady Margaret entered, her face carefully composed but her eyes showing signs of strain. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but Queen Isabella requests a moment of your time. She says it's urgent. Alexander excused himself from Princess Sophia and followed Margaret through the corridors toward Isabella's chambers. As they walked, Margaret spoke quietly. She's been writing letters all morning. I think she's preparing for something final. Alexander's step quickened. When they reached Isabella's chambers, Margaret discreetly withdrew, leaving the king and queen alone. Isabella was sitting at her writing desk, several sealed letters arranged before her. She looked up as he entered, and Alexander was struck by how calm she appeared. The frantic pain of the past few days had been replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Alexander, please sit down. There are things we need to discuss before you make your final decision. He took the chair across from her, noting how formal the arrangement felt. They might have been strangers negotiating a business arrangement rather than spouses discussing the end of their marriage. I've been writing to my sister, to my parents, to several friends, Isabella began, indicating the letters, preparing them for what may be coming. I wanted to control how they learned about this situation rather than leaving it to palace gossip and newspaper speculation. Isabella, I haven't made a final decision yet. These letters may be premature. She smiled sadly. Alexander, we both know what your decision will be. You're a good king, and good kings don't choose personal happiness over the welfare of their subjects. I've accepted that, and I want to help you make this transition as smooth as possible. Alexander felt his heart breaking all over again. You shouldn't have to be the one making this easier. You shouldn't have to be strong for both of us. Yes, I should, Isabella said firmly. Because I love you, and because I understand what the crown demands of us. I've spent the past few days being angry and hurt, but ultimately, I've had to face the truth that your first duty was never to me. It was always to the kingdom. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. Alexander recognized it immediately. It contained her wedding ring and the diamond tiara that had been his wedding gift to her. I wanted to return these to you personally, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the gesture. I know they'll need to be given to your new queen eventually. Alexander stared at the box as if it contained poison. Isabella, I can't take those. Not yet. Not until. Until what? Until you're absolutely certain? Isabella's voice held a note of gentle firmness. Alexander, I need you to stop torturing both of us with false hope. Make your decision. Choose duty over love. Choose the kingdom over our marriage. And let us both begin learning how to live with that choice. The finality in her voice forced Alexander to confront what he had been avoiding. Despite all his searches for alternatives, despite his desperate hope that some miraculous solution would present itself, he knew that Isabella was right. The military reports were clear, the political situation was deteriorating, and the marriage alliance truly was the only way to prevent a catastrophic war. The generals estimate 60,000 casualties if we go to war, Alexander said quietly. 60,000, Isabella repeated, and Alexander saw her absorb the number, felt her measure it against their personal happiness. 60,000 people who would die because their king chose love over duty. Isabella, no, she interrupted gently. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't try to make this easier for me by sharing your guilt. Just make the choice that will let you live with yourself, and let me find a way to live with it too. Alexander looked at this remarkable woman who was asking him to destroy their life together and somehow making that seem like an act of love. The strength she was showing humbled him and broke his heart simultaneously. If I choose the alliance, he said slowly, what would you want? Where would you go? How could I ensure that you're cared for? Isabella had clearly thought about this. I've been corresponding with the abbess at St. Margaret's convent. It's in the mountains, peaceful, respected. I could live there quietly, perhaps teach the young novices about literature and languages. It would be a life of purpose, if not happiness. A convent. Alexander was horrified. Isabella, you're 38 years old. You have decades of life ahead of you. I can't condemn you to spend them in isolation. It wouldn't be isolation, Isabella said gently. It would be a different kind of life. A simpler one, perhaps, but meaningful in its own way. And it would spare us both the pain of watching each other try to move on. Alexander stood and began pacing, his royal composure finally cracking. This is insane. There has to be another way. Some solution that doesn't require you to disappear from the world, doesn't require me to marry a woman I barely know, doesn't require us to pretend that 15 years of love never happened. Isabella watched him pace, her heart aching for his pain even as she dealt with her own. Alexander, stop. Please. You're making this harder than it has to be. It should be hard. Alexander exploded, his careful control finally snapping. It should be the hardest decision I've ever made. We're talking about destroying our marriage, our life together, our future. If that's easy, then what was the point of any of it? Isabella stood and moved to him, taking his hands in hers. It's not easy. It's destroying me. But some things that destroy us are still necessary. Alexander looked down at their joined hands, thinking of all the times they had stood together this way, during crises, celebrations, quiet moments of connection throughout their marriage. How could he willingly give up the person who had been his partner, his closest friend, his greatest love? I need more time, he said desperately. Time for what? To find a miracle that doesn't exist. Isabella's voice was gentle, but implacable. The Asturian delegation expects an answer tomorrow. Princess Sophia is a lovely young woman who deserves honesty about her future. And 60,000 people deserve a king who can make the hard choices. Alexander knew she was right, but accepting that knowledge felt like accepting his own death. If I do this, if I choose the alliance, I need you to know that it will never be about loving someone else more than I love you. It will be about duty destroying love, not replacing it. Isabella smiled through her tears. I know, and I need you to know that whatever anger I've felt, whatever pain this causes, I will always be proud of the man you are. Even if I can't be married to him anymore. They held each other then, both understanding that this was likely their goodbye as husband and wife, even if the formal proceedings were still to come. Outside, storm clouds that had been gathering all week were finally releasing their burden, rain lashing against the windows like tears from heaven itself. Tomorrow, Alexander would give his answer to the Asturian delegation. Tonight, for the last time, he would hold the woman he loved and try to memorize every detail of a happiness he was about to sacrifice on the altar of duty. The crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. The morning of decision had arrived with deceptive beauty. Sunlight streamed through the palace windows, illuminating corridors that hummed with barely contained tension. Word had spread throughout the staff that today would bring momentous news, though few understood the true nature of the choice their king faced. Alexander had spent the night in his study, unable to bear returning to the bed where he and Isabella had shared so many peaceful hours. Instead, he had sat before the dying fire, turning his wedding ring over and over on his finger, trying to imagine a future without it. The military reports lay before him, 60,000 potential casualties reduced to cold statistics on paper. Beside them sat the marriage contract that would make Princess Sophia his queen and save all those lives. At precisely 9 o'clock, he was due to meet with the Asturian delegation to deliver his answer. At 10, he would address his council to explain his decision. By noon, the news would begin spreading across the kingdom that their beloved queen would no longer be queen, that their king would take a new bride for reasons of state. But first, he had one final conversation to endure. Isabella arrived at his study exactly as the palace clock struck 8. She wore a simple morning dress of deep blue silk, his favorite color on her, and her hair was arranged in the elegant style she had worn on their wedding day. If he hadn't known better, Alexander might have thought she was dressed for a celebration rather than the destruction of their marriage. Good morning, she said softly, closing the door behind her. I thought we should speak once more before. Before I give you away for the good of the kingdom, Alexander finished, his voice rough with sleepless exhaustion. Isabella, I want you to know that even if I make this choice, it doesn't mean it's the right choice. It just means it's the only choice I can live with. Isabella nodded, moving to stand beside his chair. She looked down at the documents spread across his desk, the marriage contract, the military assessments, the formal letters that would announce the end of their union to the world. Have you spoken with Princess Sophia about expectations? She asked practically. Yesterday. She understands the situation and has agreed to the arrangement. She seems like a good woman who deserves better than a husband who will never love her as she deserves. And yet she's willing to accept that limitation for the good of both kingdoms, Isabella observed. She sounds remarkably mature for someone so young. Alexander looked up at his wife sharply. Are you trying to make this easier for me by praising my future bride? Isabella smiled sadly. I'm trying to make this bearable for both of us. If you're going to marry her, if she's going to be queen, then I want to believe she'll be good to you and good for the kingdom. Hating her would only add poison to an already impossible situation. The grace of Isabella's response humbled Alexander once again. Even facing the destruction of her own life, she was thinking of his future happiness and the kingdom's welfare. The council has prepared a statement explaining that our marriage is being annulled due to the absence of an heir and the urgent need for a strategic alliance. Isabella continued, her tone carefully neutral. They've crafted it to minimize scandal and preserve both our dignities as much as possible. Our dignities, Alexander repeated bitterly, as if there were any dignity in this situation. There is dignity in sacrifice for a greater good, Isabella said firmly. There is dignity in choosing the harder path because it's the right path. Don't let cynicism poison what is fundamentally an act of love. Love for your people, for peace, for something larger than our personal happiness. Alexander stood and moved to the window, unable to meet her eyes while she made their destruction sound noble. Below in the courtyard, he could see Princess Sophia taking an early morning walk with her ladies-in-waiting. She moved with grace and confidence, every inch the future queen. In a few hours, she would be his betrothed. In a few weeks, she would be his wife. What will you do today? He asked without turning around. After the announcement is made, I'll meet with Lady Margaret to begin making arrangements for my departure. The abbess at St. Margaret's has agreed to receive me within the month. I'll need to decide what personal items to take with me and what should remain here for. Isabella's voice caught slightly. For your new household. The mundane practicalities hit Alexander like physical blows. Isabella would have to pack her belongings, sort through 15 years of accumulated memories, decide which books and jewelry and personal treasures she could take into her new life, and which would remain behind to gather dust in palace storage. This is barbaric, he said suddenly, turning to face her. We're civilized people in a modern age, and we're destroying our lives based on political arrangements that would have seemed antiquated to our grandparents. And yet here we are, Isabella said simply. Because some things haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe. Power still matters more than love. Political necessity still trumps personal happiness. The crown still demands sacrifices that ordinary people would never be asked to make. A knock at the study door interrupted them. Your Majesty, came Lord Chancellor Harrison's voice. The Asturian delegation is ready to receive your decision. Alexander and Isabella looked at each other, both understanding that this was the moment. Once Alexander walked out that door and gave his answer, there would be no going back. The wheels would be set in motion that would transform Princess Sophia into a queen and Queen Isabella into a footnote in history. Before you go, Isabella said quietly, I want to give you something. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small wrapped package. Alexander opened it to find a silver locket he had never seen before. I had this made during our first year of marriage, Isabella explained. It contains a lock of my hair from our wedding day. I thought someday our daughter might want it as a keepsake of her mother. Since that day will never come, I want you to have it instead. Alexander opened the locket and found, along with the small curl of chestnut hair, a miniature version of their wedding portrait. They looked impossibly young and happy, gazing at each other with the confidence of people who believe their love could overcome any obstacle. Isabella, I can't. Keep it, she said firmly. Not as a way to torture yourself, but as a reminder that what we had was real. When you're building a new life with Princess Sophia, when you're being the king your people need you to be, remember that you were once loved completely and without reservation. Remember that you are capable of inspiring that kind of love. Alexander closed the locket carefully, his hands shaking slightly. What about you? What will you keep to remember us? Isabella smiled and touched her heart. I'll carry our memories here, where no annulment can reach them. Every book you read to me, every morning we shared breakfast, every quiet evening when we sat together and planned our future, those belong to me forever, regardless of what legal documents say. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Your Majesty, they're waiting. Alexander looked at Isabella one final time as his wife. In a few hours, she would be his former wife, a woman he had once loved but could no longer claim. The transformation seemed impossible to comprehend. I love you, he said desperately. Whatever happens after today, whatever titles we carry or don't carry, I love you. That will never change. I know, Isabella whispered, tears finally beginning to fall. And I love you. I love you enough to let you go, which is perhaps the most love I can offer. Alexander wanted to reach for her, to hold her one last time, but he knew that if he touched her now, he might lose his resolve entirely. Instead, he tucked the locket into his jacket pocket, squared his shoulders, and prepared to walk out of his study as a married man for the last time. Goodbye, Isabella, he said softly. Goodbye, my love, she replied. Be the king our people deserve. Be happy if you can. Alexander opened the door and walked out, leaving Isabella alone among the documents that would formalize the end of their life together. She remained standing by the window, watching as he crossed the courtyard toward the diplomatic quarters where the Astrian delegation waited. Princess Sophia was still walking in the gardens below, unaware that in a few minutes her life would change forever. She would become betrothed to a man she barely knew, would inherit a crown she had never expected to wear, would step into a role that had been shaped by the love of the woman who watched her from above. Isabella whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the young woman who would soon bear the weight of Alexander's crown and the burden of following a queen who had been genuinely beloved. Princess Sophia would need strength for the challenges ahead, wisdom to navigate the complexities of royal life, and patience to build love where duty had planted the seeds. As Alexander disappeared into the diplomatic quarters, Isabella finally allowed herself to weep freely. She cried for the dreams they would never fulfill, the anniversaries they would never celebrate, the quiet moments of companionship that had made even the difficult days of royal life bearable. She cried for the children they had never had, and the old age they would never share. But underneath the grief was something else, a strange sense of completion, as if she had fulfilled her purpose in loving him completely, and then loving him enough to let him go. Their marriage was ending, but what they had built together, the love, the partnership, the memories, would endure in ways that no political necessity could touch. An hour later, when Lord Chancellor Harrison knocked on her door to inform her that His Majesty had accepted the Astrian alliance, and that the announcement would be made within the hour, Isabella was composed enough to thank him politely and ask him to arrange for her belongings to be packed for departure to St. Margaret's Convent. The palace bells rang out at noon, announcing momentous news to the kingdom. Citizens gathered in the squares to hear that their king would take a new bride to secure peace and prosperity for all. Most celebrated the wisdom of their sovereign and welcomed their future queen. None of them knew that in a quiet room overlooking the palace gardens, their former queen sat writing in her journal, recording the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Isabella wrote about love and duty, about the weight of crowns and the price of peace, about the difference between endings and completions. Outside her window, Alexander's roses continued to bloom, tended now by gardeners who would soon learn to arrange them for a different queen. But the beauty Isabella had cultivated would endure, just as the love she and Alexander had shared would endure, even if the world would never know its true depth or the magnitude of its sacrifice. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape forever changed but, somehow, in its own way, still beautiful.